Caleb and Ross were not gamblers by nature, but the atmosphere of the military surplus auction had a way of distorting reality. They ran a specialized salvage yard focused on heavy industrial machinery, a business built on calculating the precise scrap value of steel, copper, and iron. They usually bought what they could see: rusted excavators, decommissioned generators, and piles of structural beams. But today was different. Lot 402 sat in the center of the warehouse floor, an anomaly among the piles of loose metal. It was a massive wooden crate, roughly the size of a small car, constructed from thick, dark timber that looked like it had weathered decades without rotting. There were no manifests, no inventory lists, and no keys. The only identifier was a faded black stencil on the side reading, Class 1 Heavy, Handle with Care, accompanied by a string of nonsensical military serial numbers. The brothers circled the crate, tapping the wood. It was solid oak, reinforced with iron banding that had turned a deep, oxidized brown. The sheer density of the object was the only clue. The forklift groaned under its weight when the auction staff moved it, suggesting whatever was inside weighed at least 2 tons. Caleb did the mental math on the weight of mixed steel scrap versus the opening bid. It was a risk. If the box was filled with concrete ballast or worthless iron weights, they would lose thousands on transport and disposal fees. But if it contained precision machinery, gearboxes, or high-grade copper wiring, they could triple their investment. The auctioneer started the bidding, and the room went quiet. Most buyers wanted sure things, not mystery boxes. Ross gave a subtle nod, and Caleb raised his paddle. The bidding was sluggish, a slow climb against one other hesitant buyer, until finally the gavel slammed down. They owned the mystery crate. Transporting the behemoth back to their yard was an operation in itself. They had to use their heavy-duty flatbed truck and a 10-ton crane just to position it safely in the main bay of their workshop. Once the crate was on the concrete floor, sitting under the harsh glare of the industrial halogen lights, the reality of the purchase set in. The box was a fortress. The wood was swollen tight, and the iron bands were riveted shut. This wasn't packaging designed to be opened easily. It was packaging designed to survive a war. They grabbed their heaviest crowbars, a sledgehammer, and an angle grinder. The air in the shop filled with the screech of metal on metal as Ross cut through the first iron band. It snapped open with a violent crack, releasing decades of tension. Hey everyone! We are taking a quick pause because the suspense of this crate opening is killing us, and we need your support. We are incredibly close to hitting our goal of 10,000 subscribers, and every single subscription helps us hunt down more amazing lost history like this. If you are enjoying the mystery, please smash that subscribe button right now. Also, we really want to know who is watching. Drop a comment below telling us which country you are watching from. And if you want to support the channel directly, check out the Super Thanks button below. It helps us keep the lights on and the tools running. Now, let's tear this lid off and see what we bought. With the iron bands cut and lying on the floor like dead snakes, the brothers turned their attention to the lid. They jammed the crowbars under the lip of the heavy oak planks. The wood groaned, the sound echoing through the quiet workshop. It took their combined weight, hanging off the ends of the steel bars, to leverage the first plank loose. As the wood lifted, a distinct, overpowering smell rushed out of the gap. It wasn't the smell of rot or mildew. It was the sharp, chemical scent of cosmoline, a heavy, wax-like preservative grease used by the military to store weapons and machinery for long-term storage. Caleb looked at Ross, his eyes widening. Rust doesn't smell like cosmoline. They were looking at something that had been preserved with intention. They worked faster now, adrenaline taking over. Plank after plank was ripped away, revealing a layer of heavy, oil-soaked canvas wrapping. The object beneath was massive, filling almost the entire volume of the crate. They carefully sliced through the canvas with box cutters, peeling it back to reveal cold, gray metal. It wasn't a generator. It wasn't a pump. It was an engine. But not just any engine. As the canvas fell away, the sheer scale of the machinery became apparent. It was a V configuration, with two banks of 6 cylinders stretching out in a massive block. The valve covers were cast aluminum, gleaming dully under the layer of protective grease. This was an engine designed for extreme power and violence. Caleb grabbed a rag and wiped a section of the block, searching for a data plate. He found a stamped engraving near the front of the block. He squinted at the numbers, his breath catching in his throat. It read Rolls-Royce. This was a Meteor engine, a direct derivative of the legendary Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire fighter planes, but adapted for the brutal torque requirements of British tanks like the Cromwell and the Centurion. They hadn't just bought scrap metal. They had bought a 27-liter V12 heart of a World War II beast, untouched and unstarted since the day it left the factory floor in the 1940s. The engine sat there, a silent, sleeping giant, worth infinitely more than the few $100s of steel they had calculated. But as they admired the find, they noticed something odd about the intake manifold, a small, taped-on envelope that had survived the decades. Caleb carefully peeled the tape from the brittle, yellowed envelope found attached to the intake manifold. The paper inside was fragile, smelling of old library books and machine oil. He unfolded it with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a scroll. It wasn't a standard manual. It was a factory dynamometer test sheet, dated November 14, 1945. The document detailed the specific performance metrics of this engine unit, serial number V12-909X. Ross leaned in, his finger tracing the rows of typed figures. Standard Meteor engines were rated for about 600 horsepower, a D-rated version of the Merlin to increase reliability for tanks. But the numbers on this sheet were different. The handwritten notes in the margin indicated a peak output of nearly 750 horsepower during bench testing. This wasn't a standard production unit. It was a blueprint engine, hand-assembled with tighter tolerances for a specific, high-performance application, possibly a prototype heavy tank or a specialized recovery vehicle that never saw the light of day. The realization hit them hard. They didn't just have a vintage tank engine. They had a factory-tuned, high-performance variant that was likely one of a kind. The value had just skyrocketed, but only if the internal condition matched the external promise. The next step was the most laborious but satisfying part of the salvage, the demothballing. The cosmoline grease that had protected the steel for 80 years was thick, sticky, and hardened like wax. To inspect the engine properly, it all had to come off. The brothers set up a perimeter of plastic sheeting and fired up their industrial steam cleaner. The process was slow and mesmerizing. As the high-pressure steam hit the engine block, the amber-colored grease melted away, dripping down into the catchpans in thick, brown sludge. Inch by inch, the true surface of the machine was revealed. Beneath the grime, the paint on the block was a pristine, deep semi-gloss black, untouched by chips or scratches. The aluminum components, once dull, began to shine. They used kerosene and toothbrushes to clean the intricate linkages of the dual carburetors, revealing brass fittings that looked like they had been polished yesterday. It took 6 hours of continuous labor, but when they stepped back, the transformation was shocking. The engine looked brand new, as if it had just been lowered off the assembly line at Crewe. It was a piece of industrial art, a sculpture of steel and aluminum that represented the pinnacle of 1940s engineering. But cosmetic beauty meant nothing if the internals were fused together. The moment of truth had arrived. They needed to see if the engine would turn over. A seized engine of this size would require a complete, expensive rebuild, costing tens of thousands of dollars in parts alone. Ross located the massive crankshaft nut at the front of the engine. He attached a heavy-duty breaker bar and a long pipe extension for leverage. Caleb stood by the cylinder banks, listening intently for any sound of metal grinding on metal. Ross gripped the bar, braced his feet against the crate, and pulled. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The inertia of 12 massive pistons and the friction of 80-year-old oil seemed insurmountable. Ross grunted, putting his entire body weight into the pull. Then, with a soft, hydraulic squelch, the resistance broke. The breaker bar moved. Slowly, smoothly, the engine began to rotate. Caleb could hear the distinct hiss of compression building in the cylinders and the soft click of the valve train operating. There was no grinding, no metallic clanking, just the smooth, heavy resistance of a tight, high-compression engine. It was alive. The oil seals were likely dried out and would need replacing, but the heart of the beast was healthy. They high-fived, the sound echoing in the shop. They had won the lottery. However, as they wiped down the tools and admired the gleaming V12, Caleb noticed something odd about the crate itself. He was standing on the edge of the wooden box, looking down into the gap between the engine's oil pan and the floor of the crate. The crate was exceptionally deep. From the outside, the box stood nearly 6 feet tall, but the engine only took up about 4 feet of vertical space. The engine was bolted to heavy wooden runners, but those runners seemed to be sitting on a raised floor. There was a discrepancy of about 18 inches between the bottom of the engine compartment and the actual bottom of the crate. Caleb grabbed a tape measure and confirmed his suspicion. The external height did not match the internal depth. There was a void beneath the engine. It wasn't just dead space for forklift tines. The construction was too solid, too enclosed. He tapped the wooden floorboards beneath the engine with a hammer. The sound wasn't the hollow boom of empty space. It was a dull thud, suggesting something was packed tightly underneath. The military rarely wasted shipping volume. If there was a false floor, it was there for a reason. They realized they couldn't access the space with the 2-ton engine sitting on top of it. They had to lift the V12 out. This was a dangerous operation. They re-rigged the overhead crane, carefully attaching heavy-duty lifting straps to the engine's factory lifting eyes. The chains pulled taut, singing under the tension. Slowly, inch by inch, the massive Meteor engine lifted free from its wooden cradle, swaying gently in the air like a suspended bomb. Ross guided it to a heavy-duty engine stand they had prepared, locking it into place. Now, the crate lay empty, save for the heavy timber runners and the false floor. The brothers jumped back into the wooden box. The floorboards were secured with heavy slotted screws, rusted into place. They used an impact driver to force them out, stripping a few in the process, forcing them to use a pry bar to rip the stubborn planks free. As the first board splintered and came up, they didn't see the concrete floor of their workshop. They saw another layer, this one made of soldered tin. It was a sealed, waterproof zinc liner, a method used in the 1940s for shipping extremely sensitive equipment overseas to tropical climates. Ross used tin snips to cut a hole in the soft metal liner. He peeled it back like the lid of a sardine can. Inside, nestled in custom-cut horsehair padding, were rows of wooden boxes, much smaller than the crate, but heavy. They pulled the first one out. It was made of polished mahogany, with brass latches, a level of craftsmanship that seemed out of place for military surplus. Caleb undid the latches and opened the lid. Inside, resting in blue velvet, was a set of tools. But not just any tools. These were massive, specialized Whitworth spanners and torque wrenches, each engraved with the Rolls-Royce script and the broad arrow military acceptance mark. They were the specific, master-grade service tools required to rebuild and maintain the Meteor engine in the field. These toolkits were incredibly rare, often lost or stolen over the decades. A complete set alone was worth thousands. But as they looked at the remaining boxes in the false bottom, they realized the tools were just the beginning. The next box was longer, heavier, and secured with a lead seal. Caleb reached for the heavy-duty shears to cut the lead seal on the second longer wooden box found within the false floor. The wire snapped with a dull ping, and he carefully lifted the mahogany lid. What lay inside made the brothers gasp. It wasn't just a spare part. It was a massive, intricate mechanical assembly that changed the entire identity of the engine they had just bought. Resting in a custom-molded cradle was a factory-fresh, Roots-type supercharger. This was the smoking gun. Standard Meteor tank engines were naturally aspirated. They relied on atmospheric pressure to suck air into the cylinders. They were powerful, but utilitarian. This supercharger, however, was the missing link that bridged the gap between the tank engine and its legendary aviation cousin, the Spitfire's Merlin engine. The presence of the supercharger confirmed their theory. This wasn't a replacement engine for a standard Cromwell or Centurion tank. This was a forced induction prototype, an experimental powerhouse designed to push the V12 from 600 horsepower to well over 1,000. Ross ran his gloved hand over the polished aluminum ribs of the blower casing. The engineering was exquisite. The intake impellers were perfectly balanced, and the drive gears were coated in a protective blue lacquer. Finding a Meteor engine was rare. Finding a blown Meteor prototype kit was unheard of in the collecting world. It turned a piece of history into a mechanical unicorn. The value of the engine just tripled, not just for the metal, but for the sheer engineering provenance. But the crate had more secrets to yield. Beside the supercharger case was a smaller, incredibly heavy carton wrapped in oil-soaked paper and bound with copper wire. It was the size of a shoebox but weighed nearly 40 pounds. Caleb lifted it out, straining against the density. He set it on the workbench and cut the wire. Inside were 12 smaller cardboard boxes, each labeled with the logo of Lodge Aviation Plugs and stamped War Department, Class 1 Priority. He opened the first small box. Inside, nestled in cotton wool, were 12 spark plugs. But they weren't the standard copper core plugs used in trucks or tractors. Ross picked one up and inspected the electrode. It wasn't steel or copper. It was a thick, distinctively dull gray metal wire. He grabbed a magnet from the tool wall. The wire was non-magnetic. He scratched it gently with a file. It was incredibly hard. His eyes widened. These were solid platinum iridium electrode plugs, designed for high-altitude bombers and high-performance interceptors where spark reliability was a matter of life and death. During the war, platinum was a strategic material, more valuable than gold. These plugs were manufactured when cost was no object. There were 144 plugs in the box, a lifetime supply for the V12. Ross did a quick calculation on his phone. The scrap value of the platinum alone in each plug was significant, but their value to high-end restorers of warbirds and vintage racing cars was astronomical. A single unused, vintage platinum Lodge plug could sell for hundreds of dollars to the right buyer. They were staring at a box containing tens of thousands of dollars in consumable parts that had been sitting under a tank engine for 80 years. The salvage gamble had paid off multiple times over. They had the engine, the supercharger, the rare tools, and now a treasure trove of precious metals. However, the final item in the false bottom was the most intellectually valuable. Tucked underneath the spark plug carton was a flat, leather-bound folio. The leather was dry and cracked, stamped with Ministry of Supply, Top Secret in fading gold leaf. Caleb carefully opened the cover. The pages were brittle, but the ink was still legible. It was the build book for the engine, a complete history of its assembly and testing. As they turned the pages, the story of the engine unfolded. The logbook revealed that this unit, serial V12-909X, was not built for the battlefield. It was commissioned in late 1945 for Project Velocity, a proposed British attempt to break the land speed record using a modified tank chassis. The project was intended to demonstrate British engineering dominance in the post-war era. The engine had been hand-built by Rolls-Royce's top racing engineers, fitted with the experimental supercharger, and bench-tested to destruction-proof levels. But the most shocking entry was on the final page. The final entry, dated January 1946, was stamped, "Cancelled. Assets frozen." The project had been scrapped due to budget cuts in the rebuilding of Britain. The engine was ordered to be crated and stored for indefinite hold. But it wasn't just stored, it was hidden. The logbook contained a shipping manifest that listed the crate's destination not as a military depot, but as a private holding facility in the countryside, marked for the attention of a Commander H. Sterling. Ross flipped the folio to the back cover. Tucked into a pocket was a folded blueprint. They spread it out on the workbench next to the gleaming supercharger. It was a technical drawing of the proposed vehicle, a streamlined, six-wheeled monster that looked half-tank, half-rocket. And there, clearly marked on the drawing, was the mounting point for the engine. But the blueprint showed something else. It showed that the engine was part of a dual system. The vehicle was designed to run two of these V12s coupled together. The manifest in the logbook listed Crate A, the engine, and Crate B, transmission and coupling drive. The brothers looked at each other. They had bought Lot 402. They immediately scrambled to check the auction listing on the computer in the office. They scrolled through the sold items. Lot 403, which had sold right after their purchase to a scrap metal recycler for pennies, was described as mixed gearbox parts, heavy. Panic set in. If Lot 403 was the matching transmission and coupling drive for this one-of-a-kind land speed record engine, they had just let the other half of history slip through their fingers. The engine was a masterpiece, but without the custom transmission designed to handle its torque, it was a lonely heart. They needed to find who bought Lot 403 before it was melted down into rebar. The logbook had given them the provenance, but it also gave them a mission. They weren't just cleaning an engine anymore. They were trying to reunite a mechanical family that had been separated for 80 years. The realization that the other half of this mechanical masterpiece was heading for a shredder sent a jolt of panic through the workshop. Caleb and Ross didn't waste a second. They pulled up the auction invoice history on the office computer, their fingers flying over the keyboard. Lot 403 had been purchased by Apex Industrial Recycling, a massive operation known not for salvage, but for volume processing. Apex didn't resell parts. They fed everything into a mega shredder that chewed up cars and appliances into fist-sized chunks of raw steel in seconds. The brothers grabbed their checkbook and sprinted to their truck. The drive to the Apex facility was a blur of highway, a race against the industrial appetite of the shredder. When they arrived at the recycling plant, the ground was literally shaking. The rhythmic, thunderous crashing of the hammer mill filled the air, a sound that meant irrevocable destruction. They bypassed the main office and drove straight to the intake yard, scanning the mountains of scrap for the distinctive shape of the wooden crate. The yard was a chaotic landscape of twisted metal and heavy machinery. Cranes with massive electromagnets swung overhead, dropping tons of steel onto conveyor belts that fed the insatiable mouth of the machine. It was a graveyard for engineering. Ross spotted it first. It was sitting near the end-of-life sorting pile, a zone designated for materials ready to be crushed. The crate, Lot 403, looked small and fragile amidst the twisted beams and crushed car bodies. A grapple excavator was working nearby, its hydraulic claw clearing the area, inching closer to the crate with every swing. The brothers didn't wait for permission. Caleb slammed the truck into park and ran toward the excavator, waving his arms frantically to get the operator's attention. The massive machine paused, the claw hovering menacingly just feet above the wooden box. The operator, confused, powered down the hydraulics. The negotiation with the yard foreman was tense but short. To Apex, the crate was just 1,500 pounds of mixed iron, worth a few $100s in scrap weight. To Caleb and Ross, it was the missing limb of a priceless artifact. They offered 5 times the scrap value in cash, on the spot. The foreman, indifferent to history but attentive to profit, took the money and waved his hand. They had bought it back. They used the yard's forklift to load the battered crate onto their flatbed, securing it with straps as if it were a patient in an ambulance. They had saved the transmission with minutes to spare. Back in the safety of their own silent workshop, the atmosphere changed from panic to reverence. They placed the rescued Crate B next to the gleaming V12 Meteor engine. This box had suffered more abuse. The wood was splintered on one side where the grapple had grazed it, but the structural integrity seemed intact. They pried off the lid, which was nailed shut with heavy-duty spikes. Inside, the packaging was identical to the engine crate. Heavy canvas, the smell of cosmoline, and the silver flash of a zinc liner. They cut open the liner and revealed the prize. It was a monstrosity of a gearbox. It wasn't a standard tank transmission designed for low-speed torque and turning tracks. It was a massive, custom-fabricated, step-up gearbox, encased in a ribbed aluminum housing to dissipate heat. Ross recognized the design immediately from the blueprints. It was a fluid coupling system, designed to take the brute force of the V12 and multiply the rotational speed for high-velocity wheel drive. It was the engineering bridge that turned a tank engine into a land speed record contender. The input shaft of the gearbox matched the output spline of the V12 perfectly. But the crate contained more than just the gears. Tucked into the side of the crate, wrapped in wool blankets, was the cockpit module mentioned in the build book. Caleb carefully unwrapped it. It was a fabricated aluminum dashboard panel, drilled and fitted with a stunning array of analog gauges. There were dials for supercharger boost pressure, oil temperature, gearbox, and a massive central tachometer redlined at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The gauges were brand new, their glass faces clear, the needles resting at 0, waiting for a signal they never received. Beneath the dashboard panel lay the final piece of the puzzle, the steering wheel. It was a large four-spoke Bakelite wheel, identical to those used in heavy bombers, but mounted on a quick-release hub. Attached to the wheel hub was a metal tag stamped Project Velocity, Unit 1. Holding the wheel, Caleb could almost feel the vibration of the 27-liter engine thundering behind him. They had all the core components of the vehicle. They had the heart, the transmission, and the controls. They spent the rest of the night dry-fitting the components. Using the overhead crane, they carefully aligned the massive gearbox with the back of the engine. The tolerance was perfect. The heavy steel splines slid together with a satisfying thunk, marrying the two units for the first time since 1946. The resulting assembly was nearly 10 feet long, a powertrain of terrifying potential. As they stood back to admire the unified machine, the phone in the office rang. It was late, far past business hours. Ross went to answer it. It was a representative from a private automotive museum in the UK. They had seen a forum post the brothers had made earlier that day asking about the Project Velocity serial numbers. The voice on the other end was trembling with excitement. The museum had been in possession of the chassis, the empty six-wheeled shell of the Project Velocity car, for 30 years. It had been sitting in their storage annex, a hollow body missing its unique powertrain, considered a static display piece that would never run. They had the body. Caleb and Ross had the guts. The brothers weren't just salvage hunters anymore. They were the owners of the only thing that could bring a dead legend back to life. The offer the museum was about to make would change their salvage business forever. The voice on the phone belonged to Dr. Eris Thorne, the curator of the National Transport Trust in the UK. He explained that for decades, the museum had displayed the Project Velocity chassis as a curiosity, a beautiful, hollow shell representing a what-if moment in British engineering. Historians had always assumed the custom powertrain was never built, scrapped on the drawing board to save money during the post-war austerity. To hear that the engine, the gearbox, and even the gauges were sitting in a salvage yard in the United States was the archival equivalent of finding the Holy Grail. A deal was struck immediately. The museum didn't just want to buy the parts. They wanted Caleb and Ross to personally escort the machinery to England and oversee the reunification of the vehicle. 2 weeks later, the brothers stood inside a climate-controlled hangar in Lincolnshire. In the center of the room sat the chassis. It was breathtaking. 30 feet of hand-formed, polished aluminum, shaped like a teardrop, sitting on 6 massive tires. It looked like a wingless aircraft designed to break the sound barrier on land. The engine bay was open, a gaping void that had been empty since 1946. The brothers watched as the museum's gantry crane lifted their V12 Meteor, now fully detailed and gleaming, into the air. The atmosphere was electric. A team of silver-haired restoration experts, men who had worked on Spitfires and Concords, watched in silence. As Ross guided the engine down, the alignment pins located the chassis mounts. It was a moment of mechanical destiny. The engine settled into the frame with a solid, heavy thud. the bolt holes lined up perfectly to the millimeter. Then came the transmission, sliding onto the rear mounts. For the first time in history, Project Velocity was a complete machine. The seemingly random scrap parts the brothers had saved, the tachometer, the steering wheel, the fluid coupling, all clicked into their designated spaces, turning a static sculpture into a living, breathing vehicle. The restoration team worked around the clock for the next 3 days to plumb the fuel lines, wire the ignition system using the platinum plugs, and prime the oil pumps. The goal wasn't just to display it, it was to start it. The museum had arranged a private event for the unveiling. On the final day, the hangar was filled with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel. Caleb and Ross were given the honor of the first start. Ross climbed into the cockpit, gripping the Bakelite steering wheel he had rescued from the shredder. He flipped the master switch on the dashboard panel. The gauges jumped to life. Caleb stood by the external starter cart. He gave the signal. Ross hit the ignition. The starter motor whined, a high-pitched mechanical scream that built in intensity. The massive V12 turned over. Once, twice, and then, with a sound like a cannon shot, it caught. Blue flame erupted from the short exhaust stacks, and the hangar was instantly filled with a thunderous, rhythmic roar. The 27-liter engine settled into a heavy, aggressive idle. The vibration shook the floorboards. The supercharger whined, sucking in cubic acres of air. It was a terrifying, beautiful noise, the sound of 1,700 horsepower waking up after an 80-year coma. The museum staff broke into applause, some openly weeping. The beast was alive. The financial settlement was finalized the next morning in the museum's boardroom. The valuation of the complete vehicle, now a running, one-of-one land speed record contender, was astronomical. The museum, backed by a heritage lottery grant and private donors, purchased the powertrain and the rights to the Discovery from the brothers for a staggering $2.4 million USD. The crate they had bought for the price of scrap steel, and the transmission they had saved from the crusher for cash, had transformed their lives. But as they flew back home, the check deposited in their business account, Caleb and Ross realized the money was secondary. They had done something few people ever get to do. They completed history. They had taken a story that ended in 1946 with a "cancelled" stamp and wrote a new ending. They returned to their salvage yard not just as scrap dealers, but as industrial archaeologists. They used a portion of the funds to build a specialized facility dedicated to recovering and restoring lost military and industrial prototypes. The video ends with a shot of the brothers back in their gritty workshop, looking at an empty space on the floor where the crate used to be. The silence of the shop contrasts with the memory of the V12's roar. They turn to the camera, smiling, dirty, and exhausted. They pick up their crowbars and walk towards a new, rusted shipping container that just arrived that morning, ready to hunt for the next lost treasure. The screen fades to black with the sound of a crowbar prying open wood, signaling that the adventure never truly ends.